All right, welcome back. This week, moving on to chapter 19. So last week we did plyometrics. This week we're going to talk about speed and agility development. One of the things that I'll say about chapter 19 is, in my opinion, it is unnecessarily complicated. When I was making the slideshow originally, I was, cutting and pasting some of the graphics that come with the NSCA presentation package. And I was like, I don't even know what this graphic is depicting, and I better go back and read this chapter and make sure I know exactly what these are. And so I do now. I understand what it is that they're talking about, but I don't know that they need to get into the level of depth that they do. So for example, they talk about velocity, and so they talk about how that is a vector quantity as opposed to a scalar quantity, which is true, right? But that's something that is covered in like biomechanics. And so, like I said, I think this chapter exceeds its necessary scope. And so to that end, one of the things you're going to see in this slideshow is really long. It's 42 slides to be exact. And a lot of those slides are just graphics, because one of the things with the NSCA presentation package is it doesn't come with all the graphics. So I scanned all the graphics that are in the book and I pasted them into the slideshow. Not that I'm going to go over them in this talk, but they're there for you if you need them, either for the quiz or for your own reference later. And also because just in case somebody didn't buy the book, I wanted to make sure that all the graphics were in there. So they are. So I'm not going to go through each individual slide. I'm going to kind of buzz through some, but I'm going to hit on the high points. So there are a few key themes that I do want to communicate that come up in this chapter, and make sure that you're aware of those, but I'll kind of leave some of the details aside as much as I can to avoid making this thing overly long. So key terms here. So speed. So the key thing about speed is to know that it's maximal velocity. So it's as fast as you can possibly move, right? So if you're running, running speed, that's as fast as you can possibly move. So the way that that's assessed is in shorter or short-ish sprints, if you will. So not sprints of 10 yards, because that's really an assessment of acceleration, but sprints of more like 40 yards or 60 yards. Those are good assessments of speed. You should be hitting top speed or pretty close to that by that 40 to 60 yard range. So speed then is your maximal velocity, and so to assess it, again, you kind of need those. They're short sprints, but again, like that 40 to 60 yard range will assess speed. Change of direction is what it sounds like. It is the ability to go from, let's say, moving to your right to, so you're obviously going fairly fast. You're going to decelerate, accept your body weight, and then push off in the opposite direction. That is going to be a change of direction type of movement. And so you see change of direction type drills if we have an athlete do something like a T drill, where they go and start at the bottom of the T, and then they go and take a hard left at the top of the T, and then they do a circle around one cone, maybe a figure eight, whatever you have them do. That's a change of direction type drill where they have to decelerate and go from moving let's say forward to moving maybe laterally even. So rather than have them actually do like a hard left turn around the middle cone, you could have them change over to like a shuffle or something like that, which then actually crosses over a little bit more into agility. So agility and change of direction have a lot in common. So being agile requires the ability to be able to change directions, but agility is more encompassing than that, because it also includes the ability to change mode. So maybe you go from a sprint to a hop, something like that. So if we're talking about like a football player who is sprinting down the sideline and they need to fake out a defender, maybe they'll jump and they'll land on one leg, and then they'll use that one leg to cut to the other one. That would be kind of a combination change of direction, agility type motion. The other thing that makes agility more all-encompassing is that agility also includes the reaction to your environment. So in change of direction, you're just going from going straight to going left, or going right to going left, something like that. In agility, you are reacting to the playing environment, maybe an oncoming defender or an oncoming ball carrier or something like that. And so in response to that, you are changing your path and potentially, like I said, changing your mode. So you can see agility includes changing direction, so from right to left, changing velocity, speeding up or slowing down, and then mode, 1 foot, 2 foot, that kind of thing. All right. So in terms of mechanics, so there are two components that we're going to talk about. Those are rate of force development and impulse, and those two are very much interrelated. This was kind of one of the things in going back and reading through the chapter. It was like, wait a minute, I better cover this impulse thing. They keep talking about area under the curve and all of that. So rate of force development is what it sounds like. It is how quickly can you develop force. So we can think of those as being powerful type motions. So how quickly can you develop a bunch of force, in plantar flexion, pushing off of the ground to propel yourself into the next step. One of the keys to maximizing running speed and change of direction and agility is maximizing the rate of force development, being able to produce a lot of force and being able to do so very quickly. So for example, you'll see that in higher level sprinters, they'll have less or lower ground contact time. So they're able to generate more force more quickly, so the foot doesn't need to be in contact with the ground quite as long, so they can be in the air in the flight phase, and that's one of the aspects that's going to allow them to run faster. So rate of force development is really important for all three skills. Impulse is the product of force development and the time applied. So one of the things, like when I taught a biomechanics class, when I talked about impulse, I talked about a baseball pitcher trying to maximize impulse. So for example, you'll see with baseball pitchers, they can really get lots of external rotation at the shoulder. So these really high degrees of external rotation that most of the rest of us can't get. Their bony anatomy is a little bit different. Their shoulder capsule is a little bit different than ours. And so because of that, they can really get these high degrees of external rotation of the glenohumeral joint. And why that matters is if they get a long arc of external rotation and have a fairly normal arc, it's a little bit lower, but fairly normal arc of internal rotation, they can be in contact with the ball for a longer period of time. So they're able to apply force to the ball because of the longer arc of motion. They're able to apply force to the ball for a longer period of time, and because of that, they're able to generate a higher velocity on their throw. So that adaptation of greater external rotation at the shoulder increases time in contact with the ball. So that's one aspect of impulse. And then let's say that they're not any stronger than you or I, but the difference in throwing velocity then is the amount of time that they can apply their force. So they increase their impulse, that leads then to a higher throwing velocity. So the way impulse is discussed in this chapter is basically the area under the curve, which I don't think is very helpful. Really, they pretty much use rate of force development and impulse almost interchangeably. And again, from my standpoint, rate of force development, and really the way that they ultimately discuss speed production, rate of force development is the really important quality. So you can see some technical definitions here of impulse and rate of force development. So there's their definitions. But again, so the interesting thing here is in impulse, the key of what impulse is this: force and time applied. And they have these really lengthy definitions. They almost mention as an aside that that's what impulse is. It's not even highlighted in the text or anything. So anyway, just from your standpoint, be familiar with that. All right, so the physics of sprinting, changing direction, and agility. So one of the things, they differentiate between velocity and speed, which is true. Speed is just an amount. It's 8 miles an hour versus velocity is an amount and a direction. So they differentiate between speed as a scalar quantity versus velocity as a vector quantity because it includes speed in a direction, which again is something that is talked about in biomechanics, but I don't know is hugely important. But in case it comes up on the quiz, that's the difference between speed and velocity. All right, so here are some of the curves I was talking about. So you got two curves here. So this is another thing where I think they go into more detail than is necessary because, so again, going back to biomechanics, so thinking of muscle actions as being vector quantities, meaning that they have both a force and a direction, we can break down muscle actions into both their horizontal and vertical components. And I think we actually talked about this way back near the beginning of this class, but you can break down resultant lines of force into their horizontal and vertical components. And so that's what you've got here, is you've got when somebody's pushing against the ground with their foot, here is in the purple line, the vertical aspect of that force, and then the blue line is the horizontal component. So when they are, so we'll start here at this dashed line. So when they're pushing out of the blocks, so you're going to get a big increase in vertical force, but also within the first tenth of a second, you're going to get a big increase in horizontal force as well. Now, once they're out of the blocks, so once they're on step 2, then you get a braking impulse. So whenever that so let's say they push off of their right foot here as they're coming out of the blocks, and then the next time their right foot hits the ground, you're going to get heel strike first, and so there's a little bit of a braking impulse or braking component to that. So you're going to slow yourself down a little bit when your heel hits the ground and you move from heel strike to mid stance. So that's what that braking impulse thing is depicting. So this is during the acceleration phase. The right side is during the maximal velocity phase. So in the maximal velocity phase, that's when they're running at top speed. So that's 30 meters or 30 yards into the run. So what you're going to see here is this is total ground contact time. So in this case, a tenth of a second. And so on this side, we have the braking side. This side, we have the propulsive or acceleration side. So again, bring my arrow back, heel strike, and then so this is mid stance basically, heel off, toe off, and then you're pushing into the next step. So again, the area under the curve is technically impulse, so that's all of the force that you've produced, and then so all of this is the force that you've produced, and then between 0 and let's say a tenth of a second, that is the time over which that force is applied. So one of the things that you'll notice here is that during the acceleration phase, there's longer ground contact time, so it's more like 15/100ths of a second as opposed to a tenth of a second during maximal velocity phase. Not really sure what you would do with that information, why that would be useful for you as a strength coach. And I don't think there's any questions about that, because like I said, too much detail. But anyway, if you happen to be reading the chapter, that's what they're talking about there. They also talk about how you should account for braking forces, known as the braking impulse during change of direction. Nervous system. So in terms of the neurophysiological basis for speed, so things to know there is that strength training enhances neural drive. So neural drive is the frequency and amplitude of depolarization of the alpha motor neurons. So remember, the alpha motor neurons, those are the nerve cells that cause contraction of the skeletal muscle fibers, so those fibers that are controlled voluntarily. And so by strength training, we're able to generate more action potentials more quickly and thus able to stimulate or activate muscle fibers faster. And so by doing that, then that'll help us to generate higher ground reaction forces, and then that'll help us to push off harder and run faster, right? So strength training enhances neural drive. Also plyometrics, so all the stuff we talked about last time. So think about your one-leg hops, your agility ladder stuff, your scissor jumps, whatever it is you want to have them do. One of the things that plyometrics are useful for is that they engage those higher threshold motor units, so those type 2X motor units, more effectively than a lot of other things. So with your plyometrics, you're moving fast, right? You're getting this quick eccentric contraction followed by a quick concentric contraction, and so we tend to engage the fastest of the motor units during those plyometric type motions. And oftentimes, really, even in strength training, to hit those higher threshold motor units, we have to be lifting fairly heavy. So 85% or more of our 1 rep max to engage those motor units. So as we've mentioned before, the way to engage those big high threshold units are either to lift heavy or move fast. So plyometrics move fast, and then we can lift heavy weights. One of the other key takeaways that they talk about a lot in this chapter, or that they mention repeatedly, is the utility of the Olympic lifts. So remember that the Olympic lifts are the snatch and the clean and jerk, and then the derivatives thereof. So maybe you do like a hang clean front squat or something like that, or hang snatches or whatever, right? Some of the movements we've talked about before. The reason that those are useful, one, is you're trying to move the weight fairly quickly, right? So if you're going from the ground up to, almost shoulder height, if you're doing a power clean, to move, more than 100 pounds, maybe 300 pounds if somebody's really strong and really powerful, to move that weight that high that's a really explosive movement. And so we have to engage all of those motor units. Again, we're going to actually start with the type 2X's there and then engage also some of the type 2A's. So that's a really explosive movement. That's going to involve rate coding right off the bat, so sending as many action potentials as possible immediately right off the bat. And so that's enhancing neural drive as well. So those Olympic lifts, those really explosive movements like a power clean, enhance that neural drive. The other thing about the Olympic lifts is, so if you think about a power clean, when somebody gets the bar up to about chest height, they have to fall under the bar, right? And so when they do that, you're going to get a strong eccentric contraction of the quads and of the hamstrings and of the glutes as they're trying to break, as they're trying to slow themselves down so they don't drop into a full squat. And so those eccentric contractions as well are really useful for especially change of direction kind of motions, because during a change of direction or agility type motion, we have to be able to absorb our body weight. And so you're going to get a big eccentric contraction there, and we have to follow that up with a concentric contraction. And so you see that, during that catch and stance phase of the power clean, as they drop under the bar, you get the eccentric contraction, and then they're going to stand the bar back up, concentric contraction right after. And so the Olympic lifts, or the variants on the Olympic lifts, train the muscles in a very similar fashion to what we're going to need to engage them, or the ways that we're going to need to engage them during running, during change of direction. So that's kind of one of the other big takeaways that they have for this chapter is the utility of the variance on the Olympic lifts. All right, stretch shortening cycle we talked about last time. So stretch shortening cycle we talked about in the context of plyometrics. So remember that the stretch shortening cycle involves an eccentric contraction, so the muscle is being stretched, but it is fighting it a little bit, right? So it's contracting but lengthening. And then you have the amortization phase, which is the space between, or the time between. And then you have the concentric part, where you're actually contracting but shortening, so you're pushing off. So you have basically the deceleration, the acceptance of weight, brief delay, amortization phase, and then the concentric part where you're pushing off, where the muscle is shortening, propelling you into the next step. That's the stretch shortening cycle. So as you can imagine, the stretch shortening cycle plays a really big role during running and change of direction. So in the plyometric chapter, we talked about, or I showed the example of the guy doing the long jump, where you're going to get, he starts at heel strike, so his heel is the first thing to hit the ground, and then he moves into mid stance, where his shin, his tibia is directly over the middle of his foot, and then he moves from that into slight dorsiflexion, so where the top of his foot's coming closer to his lower leg. That's where you're getting the shortening, and then he pushes off into the next step, so then you get that concentric contraction. Same process, you're just not pushing quite as hard during the normal running motion as you would like during the jump of a long jump, right? Close, but not quite as hard. So we engage that stretch shortening cycle. There we go. During running, but again during change of direction as well. So for example, if somebody is sprinting toward their right, and then they're going to immediately plant their right leg and then go back toward the left, you're going to get a strong eccentric contraction of those lateral muscles on the right hip, so glute medius, glute minimus, TFL, glute max, top part of glute max. They're going to rapidly stretch and then rapidly contract to try to push me back the other direction, to abduct the hip, push me back the other direction toward my left. So we'll engage a plyometric type action there when we change directions. So one of the things about the stretch shortening cycle is that it increases mechanical efficiency, which is down there in that this bullet point where it says this, right? Mechanical efficiency, and we'll talk about this actually in the next chapter when we talk about running economy. What that means is that we use less energy and thus less oxygen to run at a given speed. So the stretch shortening cycles, by taking advantage of the elasticity of the tendon, of the elasticity of the epiperi-endomysium, again, that parallel elastic component, whereas the tendon is the series elastic component. By taking advantage of that tissue's elasticity, that doesn't require any energy on my part. That's just a property of the tissue, that whenever we stretch it, it's elastic, and so it's going to recoil and go back to its original position. And so that helps propel me into the next step without requiring any ATP. Now the contractile part of that, the interaction of actin and myosin, of course, that does require the use of ATP. So the more that I can take advantage of the natural elasticity of the tissues and the fact that it doesn't require ATP to propel me into the next step, the more efficient I am, the less energy I have to use. So that's an important thing about the stretch shortening cycle. The other thing is that if we do lots of plyometrics and lots of strength training, you're going to increase muscle stiffness or upregulate muscle stiffness in their words, which is an interesting way of putting it. But anyway, you'll increase muscle stiffness, and so that muscle, the stiffer muscle is effectively more elastic, so it's going to be more resistant to that change in length, and so it'll snap back more effectively. Spring mass model, another, I don't know if we need it, but what the spring mass model is that actually also kind of describes the it describes the elasticity of the tissue. And so what we've got here is a stride. So this is the ground contact part of the stride. So let's say when the right foot's in contact with the ground. So we're going to go with the, let's go with gastroc and soleus. So we're going to go with the calf muscles. So when you initially hit the ground, the calf muscles are actually going to be slightly stretched because you're in dorsiflexion when you hit. And then as we go into mid-stance and slightly past mid-stance, that is going to compress the string, or the spring, if you will. It's actually going to elongate those tissues. They talk about the spring model as the whole leg being like the spring. The whole leg gets compressed, which is true, right? Like, so you do actually, your center of mass drops the lowest during mid-stance on one leg. So that's going to compress the spring that is your leg, and so then your leg uncoils as a spring would and propels you into the next step, right? So that stretch of the quads, the stretch of the hamstrings, the stretch of the calf complex, the triceps surae, propels you into the next step. So that's what the spring mass model is. So again, it's just describing the elasticity of the tissues, but they're describing them throughout the leg, so in the thigh and in the calf. The other thing that we got on here, so the spring mass model this is kind of the theoretical part of it. And so on this thing on the right, the purple one is the theoretical model. Your elite sprinters work a little bit differently. They have higher vertical component to their forces in the early part of the, trying to think of the word there. So there's flight phase, and then there is the stance phase. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. Take a second. So in the early part of the stance phase is when an elite sprinter is going to have the highest vertical component to the forces that they generate. And so their forces don't look quite like that theoretical model. But in somebody who is a non-elite sprinter but still pretty fast, so think about like your soccer players, maybe your basketball players, their force production is more symmetrical on the heel strike to mid-stance part, it's symmetrical heel strike to mid-stance compared to mid-stance to heel off part of the stride. So again, I don't know if that's really useful for you in designing a strength program or in helping understand speed, but now you have too much information. All right, plant phase of change of direction. So on her left leg in this picture, she is in the plant phase. And so that's the point in the change of direction movement that represents the transition between deceleration, slowing down, and acceleration, speeding back up. So as she went to change directions there on her left leg, she had to absorb her momentum, right? So she had to absorb her body mass, primarily through, again, those hip abductors on her left side in this case, but also like through the perineal musculature in the lower leg on the left side. So all that musculature has to undergo a quick eccentric contraction and then rebounds with a quick concentric contraction to accelerate her back toward her right. So where it mentions strong trunk positions. So, the stiffer your core, the less sway you're going to get, and they actually don't get into this detail, so but as you go to change direction, if you have a relatively unstable core, you're going to get more trunk and more torso sway, really, and so then that makes it harder to change direction. So the lower that you can get, the more stiffness that you can have through the abdomen and through the torso. That's also going to play a role in helping you to be faster and more efficient in changing directions. All right, stride length, stride frequency. So how fast we run is a product of these two things. So combination of stride length, which is how far you go with every step, and stride frequency, which is how many steps you take in a given unit of time. So that may be per minute, for example. Or in this case, potentially per second. Yeah, it is strides per second. So stride length, how far you step, stride frequency, how many steps. One of the things that you can see here is that what this graphic is depicting is that stride length increases first. Okay, so we go from stride 1, they're going to go, let's say, 0.25 meters, and then between stride 2 and 3, we're going to go from, what is this, let's call that 1.75 to 2, so they're going to go, and maybe it's a little bit less, maybe it's more like 1.73. So they're going to go a little bit farther on step 2, and then we're going to start to see a more pronounced increase in stride frequency here. So what matters here, the two components of running speed, stride length and stride frequency. Stride length increases first, so as you're pushing out of the blocks or as you're starting to accelerate, the first thing that you're going to do is to increase how far you step out, and then after that you're going to start taking more steps. So at those higher end, as you're getting closer to maximal velocity, that's when you see that somebody's really going to maximize the number of steps that they take. Why that matters, there's a couple different ways to train this, and there's a table that I'll point out later on that talks about ways to train it. But like some of the stuff that we do in the weight room is aimed at increasing one or the other of these components. So when we do things that increase our strength in hip extension, knee extension, and plantar flexion, and actually I'm going to buzz ahead a few slides and then come back here, right? So you can see where she's pushing off with her right leg. She's in hip extension, she's in almost full knee extension, and then she's got really good plantar flexion there. So when we do things in the weight room like deadlifts, like squats, like calf raises, I don't know if people do calf raises, but the bodybuilders do those. But the Olympic lifts, so like during power cleans, during power snatches, you're supposed to get what's called triple extension, which means that you extend the hips, the knees, and then you get some plantar flexion as well, and then you fall under the bar, right? So in doing those Olympic variants or squats or deadlifts, we're training strength and power in extension of the hips, knees, and in some cases the ankles. And so by doing that, that's helping us to push off against the ground harder, so to increase our ground reaction forces, and that's helping us to increase stride length. So when we're doing those things in the weight room, what we're trying to do is increase our ability to generate force against the ground and to increase our stride length. Stride frequency is a little bit harder to train. We don't really train that in the weight room. The way that you increase stride frequency is by doing downhill running. So if you have some nice treadmills, a lot of the nicer, newer treadmills are capable of going into a negative grade. So, you know, -1, 2, 3, etc. With that downhill running, and especially if you do overspeed training with that, you can really get them to increase their stride frequency. So hopefully by doing some of that downhill running stuff, they'll be able to translate that the next time they're out there trying to achieve maximal speed. So downhill running is one method of increasing stride frequency. The other one is towing. So there's a couple different kinds of towing. In this case, what I'm talking about is that the athlete themselves is being towed behind someone else to do this overspeed training. So the way that works is that, and you may have done this in your own athletic career, where there's two athletes, one in front and one in back. Both of them have a belt around their waist, and there's a bungee cord basically between the two of them. And so the athlete in the front takes off running while the athlete in the back holds their position until there's a lot of tension in that cord. And then the back athlete takes off. And so they're being towed behind the front athlete and being pulled by the elasticity of that bungee cord. And so basically to keep from falling on their face, they're going to have to move their legs really fast. And so that's one way of doing overspeed training as well. One of the downsides to that, my recollection is that with that kind of towing, you tend to, because you're trying not to fall on your face, you tend to really hit hard at heel strike, and so it kind of emphasizes that braking impulse, so it may not be super effective. With the downhill running, that can happen as well, but the other thing about the downhill running is that tends to produce really big eccentric forces, particularly in the quads, and so they're going to be really sore after the downhill running, so just something to think about. The other thing I forgot to mention, speaking of towing, about stride length, is that you can have the athlete, rather than being towed, they're doing the towing. So if they're doing something like pulling a sled, and actually pushing works for this too, so pushing a sled would work similarly, but they can be pulling a sled or pulling a parachute, something like that, and so that's going to cause them to have to push harder against the ground, and so that is another way, other than what we do in the weight room, of training to increase ground reaction forces, of training to increase stride length. So running speed here, so you can see stride length, stride frequency. So stride length is on the left. stride frequency is on the right. So a couple things there. So you got the elite sprinter on top and the non-elite sprinter on the bottom. So to no one's great surprise, the elite sprinter has a longer stride length at maximum velocity and a faster stride rate at maximum velocity because, that's why they run faster. The interesting thing from a data visualization standpoint here, though, is if you calculate those numbers, on the left, and I rounded a little bit, but on the left, the elite runner has 5%, there's a 5% difference in stride length versus the non-elite runner, so 5% more greater stride length for the elite runner than for the non-elite runner. On the right side, looks like there's a bigger difference, but actually, the way that the numbers are laid out on the right side, it's more like a 3% difference. So the differentiator between an elite runner and a non-elite runner, stride length, plays a bigger role than stride frequency does. Okay, so we want to be able to maximize their rate of force development so that we can maximize their stride length. Also plays a role in stride frequency, but it plays a bigger role in stride length. So that's those two. So if you're working on something, or in the weight room, a way to think about it is those lower body exercises you're having your athletes do, they should make them faster because they should help increase their stride length. And stride length is the more important of the two qualities to achieving top speed. They're both important, but stride length is a little bit more so. All right, so sprinting technique stuff. So there's 3 basic phases to the sprint. The first is the initial acceleration. So that's taken off out of the blocks or taken off out of the line. So this is the initial acceleration, and then we just have acceleration, and then we hit maximum velocity, which is what's going on here. The weird thing here is that these positions that she's in do not correspond with these up here. So late flight phase to early support, that is actually this one. So she's getting ready to hit the ground, so that's the end of the flight phase. She's about to have heel strike. So this position over here is A. Early support is when her heel first hits the ground. That is actually this one right here when her heel is hitting the ground. Then she goes to mid support. Mid support is this one where she is over the top of her foot. So her leg is almost vertical. That's mid support. And then her heel is going to come off the ground, and then she's going to push off into the next step. And so that's over here is most accurately late support and toe off. She's actually in the flight phase on the one on the left, but that's the closest they have here to late support. So I don't know why they're not in order, but they're not. All right, let's see, training goals. So again, the thing that matters the most is the rate of force development. So what we need to do to train rate of force development, actually one of the things that they mentioned, again, kind of almost in passing, is something that you're probably familiar with. Maybe even your coaches told you this. If you want to run fast, you got to run fast, right? So we actually have to practice running fast to be able to get faster. So certainly stuff we do in the weight room helps. Certainly, some of that stuff like downhill running can help as well. But the biggest thing you need to do is actually to work on running fast. Work on their mechanics. Work on their starts, right? That's going to be important. Work on eliminating inefficiencies in their movement. So, if they have a lot of like extraneous hip rotation or a lot of like cross-body arm movement and trunk rotation, certainly we want to eliminate those things. But once we've ironed out those things and made them a fairly economical, a fairly efficient runner, then we want to work on maximizing those ground contact forces and that rate of force development. So we have them work on running fast, and we have them do explosive movements. So again, plyometrics. So plyometrics are going to be really important at maximizing running speed as well. All right, so we developed the stretch shortening cycle. So again, and highlighted here, weightlifting movements are really helpful for that, as are plyometrics. So I won't go over these two, but these, like I said, are in the book. And so just in case anybody doesn't have the textbook, I scanned all of the useful graphics for you. So here's a little checklist if you're watching somebody's run of the things that you want to look for, okay? And then movements that happen during each. And then this one is common errors. So you can see the things that athletes often do wrong, and then ways that you can recommend that they fix those things. Here are more of those. So this is actually just the start in the acceleration phase, or the initial acceleration and the acceleration as termed earlier. And then during maximum velocity, here are some other errors and then coaching recommendations. All right, so agility and change of direction. So as mentioned, one of the key differentiators here is that agility involves the perceptual component, so being able to anticipate a change of direction and respond to the defender or offensive player, whatever you're doing. Let's see. So change of direction ability, the second bullet point here kind of defines change of direction ability. So it's the ability to decelerate, so to slow yourself down, to reorient yourself, so to turn to your left, for example, to face that direction, and then explosively reaccelerate in that direction. That is what a change of direction is. And then perceptual cognitive ability includes things like visual scanning, so knowing what's going on in the field. Pattern recognition is an important one. So we actually talked about that in 201, I think. Yeah, 201. So that is that the more experienced the athlete is, the better they get at picking up the important visual cues on the field. So for example, based on the defense's formation, I know that they're in a man defense or a zone defense or whatever. And so based on that knowledge, I know that that guy is probably going to be over there. And so to run around him, I need to cut to my right or something like that. So athletes get better at pattern recognition as hopefully they get better at pattern recognition as they move along in their careers, as they become more advanced, and being able to anticipate movements of the defenders, movements of the ball or the puck or whatever it is. And so then that ability to anticipate affects their agility as well. Guidelines for coaching this stuff. So there are some tables here in a minute that I'll point out that might be useful for you. So if we're working on agility training, things that we can work on. So just in doing change of direction drills, they're going to get better at deceleration and acceleration, so these bottom two. And then to enhance the cognitive ability stuff, you can do more reaction-based drills. So they have to, rather than having them do just like a normal T drill, maybe they run at you and they either go right or left depending on the coach's movement, so that we include that cognitive component as well as, they're not just kind of running through the drill like a machine, this is the pattern I do. They respond to a stimulus from the coach. And so that, like I said, incorporates a cognitive component, which hopefully then more closely mimics what they're doing in the sport. It's not exact because obviously there aren't any cones on the field, but it's more similar to what they're going to do on the field. So methods to develop speed: increase their strength, which increases their ability to push off against the ground. So one thing I would say is just because an athlete is strong, and I don't think I included this graphic, nope. Just because an athlete's strong doesn't mean that the rate of force development is high. And so that's actually something kind of mentioned in this chapter as well. And there's, like I said, there's a little table that has that stuff on it. So for example, actually when I was, 20 plus years ago now, when I was in college, I got recruited to do a study looking at basically rate of force development on a cycle ergometer. And so I was recruited because I was on the powerlifting team, and so I had a decent squat. And so the thought by the person involved in it, well, number one was that I wouldn't say no, but number two, that being somebody who was fairly strong, I would be able to generate high forces. And I could, just not very fast, because if you're doing a maximal squat, and if you're lifting big heavy weights all the time, but you don't have to move them fast, you actually don't get much faster. So how that or why that matters to you is, remember that in designing an annual program, we want to do like very general motions or general movements, so things like squats and deadlifts. But as we get closer to the sports season, we're going to do more specific preparation, so we're going to have to start moving at the speed of sport. If you just have the athletes lift heavy all the time, it's not going to make them slower per se, but it's certainly not going to make them as much faster as they could be if they practiced moving fast, if you will. So just because an athlete has lots of strength doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be very fast. And so in that particular experiment, I was terrible at it. Like I said, I could generate high forces, but I could not do so very quickly. And so there were a lot of like smaller athletes who weren't lifters who beat me, like soccer players, et cetera, who had a much higher rate of force development than I did and a much higher running speed than I did. Mobility. So mobility is being able to move through the desired or necessary range of motion, as opposed to flexibility, which is something that we could measure with a goniometer. the joint's total range of motion. So flexibility may not really matter for maximal running speed. What matters more is mobility, that they're able to extend the hip as far as necessary, not that they're able to have a really high degree of hip extension as measured by a goniometer or something. Agility drill progressions, they draw some distinctions between change of direction and maneuverability. I don't know that it's necessary that you know that, but you'll see maneuverability in some of their charts. I think just that one. I talked about stride length, stride frequency. So here's overspeed training. So you'll see things like bungee cord pulls, downhill running, some of the stuff I mentioned earlier on this slide, and then resistance training. So towing, incline sprinting, sled pushing, etc. Perceptual cognitive abilities. This is the same thing I was talking about earlier, that to maximize agility, not only do we have to work on change of direction, but we also have to work on change of direction in response to a stimulus. And so that's what this slide deals with. Some key terms that I won't read to you there. And to be honest, of course, these key terms overlap quite a bit with the same key terms we've talked about in the past: frequency, intensity, repetitions. So you're familiar with those at this point. Same thing, series, set, volume, work-rest ratio. None of that should be groundbreaking at this point in the course or in the textbook. Different methods to develop agility. So they got a variety of different ideas here in table 19.4. Another thing, I may have accidentally put this slide on there, or this chart on there twice. If I did, I apologize. Strategies to develop speed. We've kind of already covered that, but they do take you through 5 steps. And so this will shock you not at all. The 5 steps are basically the same steps that we covered back in chapter 17 when we talked about program design. So needs analysis, look at their strengths and weaknesses. So again, a lot of the stuff repeats from some of the stuff we talked about earlier. So there are the various steps. And then these I won't tell you about, but they are just graphics that I thought would be useful if you're doing or for your end of semester project. So they give progressions and different kinds of ideas for how you would structure a program to develop speed. So this is all speed development stuff. And then we have agility development here, sample program for agility development. And then if you wanted to test it or monitor agility development, then this slide's helpful. All right, so that's it. So like I said, take advantage of that slideshow and all the tables and all of the graphics that are in there. Make sure that's open when you take the quiz for this week. So that's it for speed development. The next time we're actually going to move on to endurance training, which is going to overlap quite a bit with what we talked about in Coaching 345. So hopefully a lot of that will be things that are familiar to you and very much of a review. So we'll see you next time for Chapter 20.